This conference will now be recorded.
Okay. Thanks for the minutes. Okay, what can you see now? I feel like
I'm seeing a blank screen.
Okay. It says sharing is paused.
There we go. I see it now.
All works now?
Yeah.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So thanks for the invitation to present on PRISMA 2020. First, I just need to declare my funding. I'm currently supported by an Australian Research Council Discovery Early Career Researcher Award. And I also need to declare that I co-led the development of PRISMA 2020, but have no commercial interest in the use of this reporting guideline. I also want to acknowledge my co-authors of this piece of work. So there are about 25 or 26 of us who spent quite a lot of time over the last few years on updating the PRISMA statement to PRISMA 2020. And in addition to the co-authors of the guideline, we also had a large number of individuals across the world who contributed in other ways to the guideline itself by completing surveys about PRISMA or piloting of the draft versions or commenting on the preprint itself. So a lot of people have provided some input into the content of PRISMA 2020. So I always like to acknowledge them at the start of these presentations. So what I'm going to talk about in this session is just give you a bit of rationale as to why we decided to develop the PRISMA 2020 statement and what methods we used to develop the updated guideline. I'll then give an overview of the PRISMA 2020 statement, and then I'll go into a bit more detail regarding the particular items in PRISMA 2020 and also presenting the new flow diagram that we've created as part of the guideline. And as I say, I'll be happy to answer all your questions at the end, but feel free to type them in the chat along the way. So just to start off about the rationale and development of PRISMA 2020. For those of you who are doing systematic reviews yourself, you probably are aware of the fact, or perhaps you may not have considered it yourself yet, but those who end up using our systematic reviews, be they patients, clinicians, other researchers, or guideline developers, they need to know what we have actually done as authors and what results we've found in order to make best use of the systematic review that we disseminate. And so what we want is for authors to report their reviews completely and accurately and transparently for a number of reasons. First of all, doing this should allow others, if they so wish, to go ahead and repeat the methods that we've used to see if they come up with the same result. So this is a form of verifying the findings of a systematic review. In addition, clear reporting should enable others to assess the trustworthiness of the review findings. Any of you who have been involved in appraising a published systematic review will probably have been confronted with the fact that some of your assessments of risk of bias via AmStar or ROBUS are often rated as unclear risk of bias because some key piece of information about the methods was just not reported. So clear reporting should prevent these unclear risk of bias judgments when you're assessing or appraising systematic reviews. In addition, clear reporting of a review should enable those end users to assess how applicable the findings are to the setting in which they want to apply those findings. So users tend to need to know whether all of the included studies focused on a particular population or setting to know whether the findings will have any relevance to their current practice. So what does PRISMA mean and where did PRISMA come about? I always like this particular tweet from Andrew Booth, which was pretty much arose in part of a Twitter discussion pointing out the fact that many systematic review authors tend to, when they tweet their systematic review, often they tend to, the image that they choose to tweet often tends to be the flow diagram, rather than the arguably more important image, which would be, say, a forest plot of the primary outcome. And they assume that this is possibly because people wanting to really, I guess, highlight how much work they did in terms of screening many articles. And it fits in the PRISMA acronym quite nicely. But PRISMA actually stands for the Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analyses statement. And so this was a minimum set of 27 items recommended for reporting, which was published back in 2009 for this group of people listed on this slide here. It's gone on to be quite influential, having been cited more than 60,000 times in multiple systematic reviews, but also in a lot of methodology papers as well that have used PRISMA as a way to assess the completeness of reporting of published reviews. It's also gone on to be endorsed by more than 400 journals, and it's also spawned 11 extensions to the main statement itself, each focusing on particular types of systematic reviews, such as reviews of diagnostic test accuracy, or to particular types of methods, such as reviews with network meta-analysis or reviews with meta-analysis of individual patient data. Now, the reason why we decided to go ahead and update PRISMA was because back in 2017, we realized that several changes have occurred in the last 10 years in the methods that are available for systematic reviews, be they text mining methods for speeding up systematic review processes. There's also some new methods for synthesizing results when meta-analysis is not possible or appropriate. And there's been advances in the tools we use to appraise the studies included in our review. And all of these changes have not been accompanied by updates in guidance for how to report the use of these methods. There's also been some changes in the last decade in terminology used to describe particular steps of the systematic review process, and also in the avenues that are available for disseminating systematic review reports and their underlying materials. And in addition to that, we've noticed by evaluating the reporting quality of existing systematic reviews that poor reporting of some items persists, and we suspected that the reason for that might be because some items themselves might have been containing a bit too many elements, which meant that it was harder for readers to understand what exactly it is that they needed to report in order to fully adhere to a particular item. So we thought we would take the opportunity to rearrange the layout and rephrase the items to help increase clarity. So we had various steps in order to develop PRISMA 2020, and we've outlined these in a paper earlier this year in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology. So we've got a lot of detail describing how it is that we actually developed PRISMA 2020 in that paper. And essentially what it involved was doing a literature review, a survey, some consensus meeting, and quite a lot of drafting amongst the co-authors to get this guidance out. And I'll just speak briefly about each step of the process. So as a first step, back in, I think, 2018, we started this particular project. We noted that there was already quite a lot of existing guidance for how to report a systematic review available in the time since the 2009 PRISMA statement was released. And so we thought we should make use of all this additional reporting guidance and see whether there's any new items that we could collate from those sources which then could be considered for inclusion in PRISMA 2020. And so we essentially collated the original 2009 checklist, its explanation and elaboration document, and all of the PRISMA extensions, other reporting guidelines for systematic reviews, for example, Cochrane's SA reporting guidance, as well as guidance from other societies, such as the American Psychological Association, each of which had produced some guidance on how to report reviews. We also looked at the reporting guidance in key conduct manuals for reviews, and some tools for assessing quality or risk of bias, as well as some identifying some tailored checklists for evaluating reporting. And across these 60 guidance documents, we collated 221 unique reporting items. And in this figure here, you'll see that essentially what we've done is we've listed across the bottom all of the 27 items in the 2009 PRISMA statement. And we've just got in this bar chart here the number of additional items that could be added to each of these 27 items. And so, for example, we see that at item number 14 on the synthesis of results, collating from the other existing guidance for reporting reviews, there are 18 other elements that could be added somewhere to PRISMA, be it in the checklist itself or in the accompanying detailed explanation and elaboration document. But essentially all items in the original PRISMA statement could have been supplemented with additional guidance, we found. So we followed this literature review by conducting a survey from June to July of 2018 to get people's views on the current PRISMA items and their thoughts on some possible new ones that we could add. And so we invited 220 individuals, including all members of the original PRISMA group and the PRISMA for Protocols group, leads of all the PRISMA extensions, editors-in-chief and associate editors from the BMC Systematic Reviews Journal and Research Synthesis Methodology, some Cochrane Methods Group conveners and scientific committee members, and then some others nominated by the steering group. And of the 220 people we invited, we got responses from 110 individuals from based in 22 countries. And so of these respondents, we found that, oh, sorry, are you only seeing part of the slides? Or is it just, I just noticed something in the chat.
Hi, Matthew. I think it's just the part of the right part of that figure that's cut off.
Okay, so I think, I don't know how, let me see. I'm not sure how to stretch it because I can see a green square that's not capturing everything. So sorry about that. I'll stop sharing and then I'll start again. So no, I'll stop again. Sorry about this. I'm not sure. I haven't really used this much. Okay.
I wonder if it's the ratio maybe that.
Can you see it all now?
Yeah, now I see it. That's great.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry about that. I realized, hopefully you didn't miss too much from all the other slides. I will send these slides at the end as well. So yeah, sorry about that. I didn't realize that it was cropping that. Okay, so for the survey itself, as I said, we had 110 respondents, and looking through, essentially the survey itself was asking for them for their feedback on all of the 27 items. And we found that more than 2/3 recommended that we keep 6 of the items as they were. More than 2/3 agreed that we should modify 15 of the existing items, and more than 2/3 suggested that we include 5 of 12 potential new items. But one thing we weren't expecting was how much detailed comments people would provide in addition to the quantitative aspects of the survey. So we essentially had about 250 pages of free text comments to sift through across all the respondents, with a lot of people providing detailed justification for why they believed a certain item was essential to include or essential to modify in some way. So that was ended up doing a bit of qualitative analysis of those comments itself, which was very useful to lead into the next step, which was a consensus meeting in which we discussed the findings of these survey and the literature review. So we held this consensus meeting from 13 to 14 September in 2018, just prior to the Cochrane colloquium in Edinburgh. And we had 21 attendees from 7 countries and presented the data from these 2 initial steps, and then discussed as a full group how to go about modifying the existing items, whether they needed any modification at all, whether to include certain items, and then how to go about disseminating and implementing PRISMA 2020 once it was completed. And so following the meeting, for which we generated quite a lot of data and notes that we had to collate afterwards, we then had a long period of drafting the statement paper itself, with initially the draft of the checklist and the full explanation and elaboration document and its flow diagram was initially drafted in December of 2018. And then we had around 6 rounds of feedback from all our 26 co-authors throughout 2019 and 2020. By the time it was about April in 2020 that we decided we were at a point where we were ready to get some feedback from possible end users on the statement, and got 15 authors ended up providing their feedback on the preliminary draft. And then we uploaded a preprint of PRISMA 2020 in September 2020 itself, and then got more feedback from the peer reviewers and from people who decided to read the preprint and give us feedback as well. So quite a lot of people giving feedback throughout this whole process. And just something to summarize here, I always like pointing this out, particularly to early career researchers, that I think some people tend to think that once you get a PhD, you're not going to have someone commenting so much on all your papers anymore, but that's definitely not the case, and it wasn't the case in this particular project, where across the 6 drafts there are around 6,000 suggested changes from the co-authors, with many of these drafts looking something like this, with lots of track changes and comments and insertions and deletions of text. So I often like presenting this just to reassure people that this is not just my view and my views in terms of the guideline. We ended up having quite a lot of input from all of the collaborators on this piece of work. And then in March of this year, in 2021, we published the PRISMA 2020 papers, and we opted for a model of co-publishing these papers in several journals, so the BMJ, PLOS Medicine, Systematic Reviews, Journal of Clinical Epidemiology, and the International Journal of Surgery, all published the main statement paper, which includes the checklists, and then BMJ also published the explanation and elaboration paper. And so this approach of having the paper published in multiple journals was really a way of kind of signifying to the systematic review community that this is not just guidelines recommended by one journal, it's endorsed by several of these journals who have been big endorsers of the guideline over the years, and in helping to get people to embed it within the systematic review process. And since it was released in March this year, we've had quite a bit of attention has directed to the papers. with more than 200,000 views of the papers collectively, and they've already been cited more than 800 times, which is quite a big, pleasant surprise to all of us who have worked on it over the last few years. And we also disseminated it via Twitter as well, and got quite a few thousand people enthusiastic about it. And I think my favorite tweet on that day was when someone claimed that this was the equivalent of academic Christmas, the release of this new set of guidelines. So I'll now just give an overview of the content of PRISMA before going in more detail about the items themselves. The PRISMA 2020 statement is divided into 7 sections and includes 27 items, but some of the items have been split up into smaller sub-items as a way to, we hope, help improve or increase clarity of the items themselves. Essentially, all the sections you would expect to see in a manuscript are covered by PRISMA 2020. From the title to the discussion and other more administrative information. And so just some key changes compared to the original statement. We have all checklist items have undergone some revision with the use of more inclusive wording regarding different methods. So what I mean by that is the fact that in the original PRISMA statement, it was geared quite heavily towards systematic reviews with meta-analysis of the effects of interventions. And so it includes particular terms like PICO, regarding the PICO question for that type of review. And we decided this time, given that a lot of authors were already attempting to use PRISMA 20, the PRISMA 2009 statement for reviews that were not focusing on the effects of interventions, we thought that we might help them by using a bit more broader language that captures, essentially making the guideline more applicable to a range of different review questions. We also reordered the items for better flow and split some of the items that were currently quite long into sub-items. We did introduce a small number of new items, substantially revised the explanation and elaboration document and sought some new examples to illustrate them, and then made some changes to the flow diagram templates. So just highlighting some key changes, this time around PRISMA 2020 has a more explicit request to report the full search strategies for all databases, registers and websites. So the original PRISMA statement asked authors just to present just one or at least one search strategy, whereas now we're encouraging people to provide all of their search strategies as a way to help others who are interested in maybe replicating the search or checking it to see if there are potentially any errors. By having all those search strategies, that will make that job easier for those people. We also have a more explicit request to report how outcomes were defined and which results were sought from the included studies, something which was not really fleshed out in much detail in the original PRISMA statement. There's also a more explicit request to report whether you've used any automation tools at various steps of the review process, such as for study selection or data collection. We are now asked people to report characteristics and risk of bias among studies that contribute to each synthesis, because I think a lot of people tend to do a very good job of summarizing the characteristics and risk of bias of studies across all studies included in the review, but it's often more helpful to know whether, if, for example, you have a review including 10 studies, but only 3 contribute to the meta-analysis of your main primary outcome, it's sometimes more useful to know what the characteristics of those 3 studies are in that meta-analysis itself. In addition, we also ask people to provide information on protocol amendments and the conflicts of interest of review authors. Something that would be, I think, typically expected for any journal article, but conflicts of interest was not really included in the main checklist items of the original PRISMA statement. In addition, we had have included some new items on synthesis of results. So we've essentially split a single item on synthesis into a range of different steps, and I'll show you what those are in a few slides. We also have new items on methods for assessing certainty in the body of evidence and the results of those assessments. And I also ask people finally to indicate whether they've made their data files or analytic code and any other materials, such as a list of citations that were screened, whether they've made that publicly available so that others are able to reuse all that information if they were to update the review in future. So where can you find all the information on PRISMA? What we've done is we've substantially updated the PRISMA statement website so that when you go to the home page and to the main PRISMA statement tab, the 2020 checklists and flow diagrams now appear on these homepage, and so they've essentially superseded and replaced the 2009 checklist. So all of the latest versions of the checklist itself, if say we are to make some minor updates in future, will appear in the will appear on this website. I just saw someone's pointed out there was no sound. Is anyone else having problems?
Matt, my sound's fine on my side. I'm not sure if it's maybe connectivity issues.
Okay, so I'll just keep sounds going. Sounds fine. Okay, I'll keep going then. Okay,
thanks.
Thank you. So yep, as I said, that's the link to the PRISMA statement website, which has all the checklists. This is the checklist itself. It spreads across 2 pages, just like the original statement, and as I said, covers all of the areas across the systematic review process. So we have Word versions and PDF versions of the checklist that are available on the PRISMA statement website. But in addition, we've created a Shiny app, which allows people to complete their checklist online here, so they can type in the location in their article where they've adhered to each item, and then they can generate a Word document or a PDF report that then they can attach when they're submitting a manuscript. And so there's either option is fine. You can use the Shiny app or you can use the Word version. We just decided to make multiple options available to complete these checklists. In addition, we have this accompanying explanation and elaboration paper, which provides a lot more detail as to how to adhere to each of the items in PRISMA 2020. And what we've done is we've written the paper in a standardized way, in that for each item in each of the 27 items in PRISMA 2020, we start off with an explanation as to why the item should be reported. Then we list, using some bullet points, some essential elements recommended for reporting, which essentially break down and provide a bit more detail as to what we expect people to report in their review. And then we have an exemplar representing good reporting practice for each item in PRISMA 2020. We also have in a supplementary file several, I think up to 4 examples per item that we've collated to illustrate how to report that item. Now, in addition to the explanation and elaboration document, or in lieu of that, we've also created this expanded checklist, which essentially takes the essential elements from the explanation and elaboration document and just puts them all in one document. So some people may find it's easier to just go through this expanded checklist, which tells them what to report, and essentially sifts out the explanations as to why to report them and the examples as to how to report them. So What you'll notice if you take a look at this expanded checklist, which is also on the PRISMA statement website, is that there are a lot of bullet points are preceded by an if statement. And essentially the reason for that is because we know that not everyone will use all items that are available to a systematic reviewer. So not everyone will search trials registers as well as searching grey literature and using automation tools to facilitate the screening process. And so what we did though with this expanded checklist is we've provided guidance on what to do if you have actually used those methods, but you can easily skip over them in this checklist if they are not applicable to your review. And so now what I'll do is just go and illustrate each of the items and the flow diagram itself, and then I'll wrap up and we can stop for some questions. So just to cover and say a bit about each one, essentially these items, the preliminary items in PRISMA 2020 are quite similar to the original. We're expecting people to identify their report as a systematic review. And then we have provided a new table in the PRISMA 2020 paper, which outlines 12 items recommended for reporting in the abstract for a review. And so there's a separate table in the paper to help you report your systematic review abstract. Our introduction items in PRISMA 2020 are quite similar to the original statement, in that we're asking people to provide rationale for their review in the context of existing knowledge, and then to provide an explicit statement of what the objectives of the review are, or what the questions the review are actually going to address. And so your rationale or objectives are what you would typically expect to see in any scientific report, and where some people said that you probably don't need this in PRISMA 2020, but we still thought that it's helpful for those who are new to writing scientific papers, including systematic reviews. And so that's why we included these items. Then the first items for the method section, the eligibility criteria and information sources. So item 5, ask people to specify their inclusion and exclusion criteria for the review. And then some new elements that we've recommended is to get people to also document how studies were going to be grouped for the syntheses that they'll end up considering later in the review. And so what we're trying to get at there is that some people, or a lot of people, do a good job of specifying what type of studies are eligible for the review as a whole, but it's often a bit unclear as to what studies are going to be eligible for each particular meta-analysis or each particular synthesis. And so, for example, how are they going to group studies with outcomes measured at various time points, or using interventions at various dosages or durations of treatment. And so we're just asking people to make it a bit clearer to readers what's eligible for the review as a whole, and then how they were going to group those studies in later syntheses in the review. Then for item 6, we're asking people to specify a range of sources that they might have consulted to identify studies, such as any bibliographic databases, trials registers, websites, contacting of individuals or organizations, and then to specify when each of these sources were last searched or consulted. Following that, we then ask people to provide their full search strategies for all of the sources that they've consulted, including any filters and limits used. Then we ask people to specify the methods they use to decide whether studies meet the inclusion criteria of the review or not. And this can include how many reviewers screened each title on abstract record and each full text report retrieved, whether they worked independently or not, and if they did use some automation tools, what tools were used and how were they used in the process. Similar type of wording is used for the next item on data collection methods. So we've built in a bit of repetition within the items just to ensure that people know that we do recommend that they cover and make it clear that these type of steps were used across various steps of the review process, such as screening and data collection and risk of bias assessment items. Then for the items on data items, we've essentially split that, because in the original PRISMA statement, we felt that it wasn't really clear, or there wasn't really explicit guidance on how to report which outcomes are of interest to the review. And not only that, what sort of results would be eligible for inclusion from the studies you find. And so sometimes we find that the study papers we come across have multiple results that are eligible for inclusion in our meta-analysis. So a study might report pain at 3 time points using 3 different measurement scales, and it can be unclear whether review authors are actually going to extract all of that data and combine it in some way, or use some hierarchies of measurement instruments and time points or analyses. And so we're asking people if they've used any methods to sort of select a subset of results for each outcome to specify them in the review, so that readers can, I guess, make a judgment of how valid that process was. And then item 10B asked people to specify and define all the other variables for which they collected data on, such as participant and intervention characteristics and any funding sources of the included studies, and then any assumptions they might have had to make about any missing or unclear information within the included studies. Our next items are about what methods we use to assess risk of bias in the included studies. For example, again, what tool is used, how many reviewers assessed the studies, and again, whether any automation was used to facilitate this process. Then moving on to what type of effect measures, such as risk ratios or mean differences, were used in the synthesis or presentation of results. And then we come to a set of 6 sub-items on synthesis methods, essentially breaking down the process, knowing that there's quite a lot of steps that are involved in synthesizing data from included studies. And so first off, we ask people to describe the processes used to decide which studies were eligible for each synthesis, such as tabulating the intervention characteristics and comparing them against the groups that you identified earlier on in the review. Then describe any methods required to prepare the data for synthesis, such as handling any missing statistics. Then describe any methods used to tabulate or visually display results of individual studies and syntheses. This is again going back to an issue that a lot of people typically would think that the forest plot is the only thing that you could use to summarize and synthesize findings in a review. But there's many options now available to better convey the findings of your review when you've either done meta-analysis or haven't been able to do meta-analysis. And so making it clearer to readers what approaches you used, we think will increase transparency of the review. Then 13D is really about what sort of statistical synthesis methods you might have used, such as if you use meta-analysis, what model methods used to identify heterogeneity were used, and any software packages used. And then 13E and 13F ask people to describe methods for exploring heterogeneity, such as subgroup analyses, and any sensitivity analyses that were used. And then our final 2 items for the method section are asking people to describe methods to assess the risk of bias in a synthesis that might arise because you have some unpublished studies or selectively reported results in the included studies. And then the final item asks for a description of any methods used to assess the certainty or confidence in the body of evidence for an outcome. An example of that, a process you might use it is the grade process for assessing certainty. So that's up to the methods. So not too long now, just the results items. We have people, we recommend people provide a description of the results of their search and selection process first off. So from the number of records identified to the number included in the review, ideally using a flow diagram, which I'll show on the next slide. And then also to cite any studies that might appear to meet the inclusion criteria, but which were excluded, and explain why. And that's really just, I guess, as a way to help you defend yourself against any accusations that you might have selectively excluded certain studies that most readers would expect to see included in your review. So this is the new flow diagram template, and essentially it can be divided up into a range of different flow diagrams. So the main section is this pink section here, which is what the original flow diagram is, similar to what the original flow diagram looks like, asking you for the flow of information identified from databases and registers. And so if you only search databases and registers, then you only need to complete that middle panel. But if in addition you search some other sources such as websites or organizations, or citation searching from the studies you identified in that first step, then you can use this additional part of the flow diagram. Sometimes people are doing an update of a review, and so we've got an additional box for them to indicate how many studies were included in the previous version, which then links down to the box at the bottom, combined with the new studies. And then if you used all three different approaches, then you could use complete the whole flow diagram. And so we have separate Word templates available on the PRISMA statement website, so you can actually be able to construct them however you want. But in addition, we have created a Shiny app to allow people to generate a figure of the flow diagram by just filling in the corresponding numbers in this panel here and ticking whether you need each component of the flow diagram in this top box up here. I saw a comment there, will these slides be made available? Yes, we'll have them emailed after the webinar. Then the final set of sections of PRISMA 2020 for the results, we have recommendations to cite each study and present its characteristics, also present the assessments of risk and bias for each study, and the results of the individual studies themselves, such as summary statistics or effect estimates, ideally using tables or plots. And then the results of the syntheses, we have 4 sub-items, starting off with asking people to summarize the characteristics and risk of bias among the contributing studies, then presenting the results of your meta-analyses or other statistical syntheses, such as the summary estimate and its precision, then results of your investigations of causes of heterogeneity, such as your subgroup analyses and then your sensitivity analyses. And then finally, your assessments of any risk of bias due to missing results or assessments of certainty in the confidence of the body of evidence. So these essentially map onto the equivalent method section items. And then we have recommendations of what to report in the discussion section, including a general interpretation of the results in the context of other evidence, any limitations of the evidence included in the review, so the limitations of the included studies, and then in addition, any limitations of the methods that you yourself used, so acknowledging whether the search you might have conducted may not have been as comprehensive as you would initially hope it to have been, or you may not have been able to identify or obtain some unpublished data, for example. And then finally, to discuss any implications of your review for practice and policy in future research. Then the final bit of PRISMA 2020 asks for some more administrative information captured under other, essentially asking people to declare whether they've actually registered their review in advance and to provide the register name and number, or to just state that it was not registered at all. Also to indicate if they prepared a full review protocol and made that available or not, and then to describe and explain any changes from the information provided at registration or in the protocol. Then also these last 3 items are just essentially to ask people to describe any sources of financial or non-financial support for the review and the role of the funders and sponsors. then to declare any competing interests of the review authors, and finally to report whether they have made publicly available any of the following pieces of information, such as a template data collection form, the raw data extracted from the included studies, data that's used in any analyses, such as a RevNav file or a CSV file, if you're using other software, and then any analytic code that might have been used, such as R code or code used in Stata to generate your meta-analyses, and then any other materials used in the review. And so they're all the items. And thankfully, Andrew Booth has updated his original tweet on PRISMA, now saying that it's going to be standing for, please remember, I used to have 20/20 vision until I screened many articles. And so the take-home message is that PRISMA 2020 essentially replaces the 2009 statement and includes some new reporting guidance that reflects advances in methods to identify, select, appraise, and synthesize studies. We have not only Word versions of the checklists and flow diagrams, but also Shiny apps for people to complete and submit with their manuscripts to a journal. And we recommend people access the PRISMA statement website for the latest versions of the checklist and flow diagrams. And if you have any questions or uncertainties about any of the elements in PRISMA 2020, you can always email me at this email address or contact me via Twitter at MJPages. That's all I was going to say, so I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you, Matthew, for such a great presentation and introduction to PRISMA 2020. So well done to you and your team on this. Well, it looks like it was a massive undertaking, so well done for that. And yeah, I've obviously been using PRISMA 2009 for many years. Found it as a great resource, and I'm pretty sure PRISMA 2020 will be even better.
We hope so. Yeah.
Yeah. It looks great. I read some of the publications around it, and it really looks great. I'm tracking the chat. Okay, so we're getting Londiwe saying great presentation. Thanks so much, Matthew. I wonder if there are any questions that are coming through. Yeah, there will be a webinar recording, and you'll find it on YouTube. I was wondering, Matthew, from your side, what do you think that we as colleagues in this field of evidence-based healthcare systematic reviews, what can we do to promote the correct use of PRISMA 2020, and even just the use of it, I guess, amongst colleagues and peers in our field? Are there any suggestions that have come up?
I mean, I think disseminating these type of webinars is helpful. I think not everyone knows that the PRISMA is out. So sometimes when I've given these presentations, people have noted that they hadn't noticed that it had changed. So I think if you are working on systematic reviews with co-authors, really just asking them to get encouraging people to use it from the start of the review, so getting in touch with your co-authors and other people working in systematic reviews in other your institutions or hospitals or otherwise, and just making them aware that the thing that we prefer people to do the most is to get them to take a look at PRISMA at the start of the writing process, because what we think often happens is that most people tend to only really look at the PRISMA checklist when they come to submitting their article for publication, and we think that that's not necessarily the best approach, because by that stage you've spent hours working with your colleagues drafting the manuscript, and you're probably at a point where you don't really want to make any changes and your word limits have been met and all that. So we think that getting people engaged with the checklist early on in the process of drafting will be most useful to them to better adhere to it. So I think as soon as I guess we sort of send around, well, as soon as PRISMA came out, we obviously alerted people in our networks that it was available. But also in addition to just when you're submitting your systematic reviews for publication, attaching the new version itself will raise the awareness of editors. We've done some contacting editors ourselves, but if there are other sort of societies or evidence-based healthcare societies in your area that you think it would be helpful to reach out to them, then we'd be very much encourage that. So yeah.
Oh, great, thanks. I see a question that came through from Diana. She says, thank you very much, very comprehensive. What do you think is the most important change?
Most important change? Well, that's a hard question because I feel like there's, lots of changes really. I think that probably for those who have not been, I think for those who probably don't tend to do Cochrane reviews and have largely done their reviews outside of Cochrane, I would say that something that would be probably new to them is the new items recommending them to consider the certainty in the evidence. So that's something that is not really routinely done across all systematic reviews. So using things like grade to assess certainty in the body of evidence. So we really think that consulting those items will be quite useful, and the explanation document provides a lot of links to that particular method to help people become more familiar with that step of the process. Because I think we've definitely noticed that once something is put into PRISMA, then, so for example, the original PRISMA had items on risk of bias assessment, which often then led to an explosion in the number of reviews using risk of bias assessment tools. And we think a similar thing might happen with these new items on assessing certainty. So, yeah.
Okay, great. And then there was another question from Tariq. For a narrative synthesis approach, how does one address the checklist items related to heterogeneity and other quant issues, for example? And then guidance for qualitative SRs seem to be limited.
Yeah, so there's 2 points there. So the guidance, we don't have any guidance on reviews of qualitative studies, but I recommend people consider what's called the NTREQ statement. So I think it's ENTREQ, which was released, I think, in 2014, and that's designed specifically for systematic reviews of qualitative studies. In terms of those who have done more of a narrative type synthesis in their review, we do provide some guidance in the expanded checklist and in the explanation and elaboration document on how you will summarize your methods and your findings of a more narrative synthesis, including how to summarize estimates of heterogeneity. But in addition to those, the guidance in PRISMA 2020, we recommend people also consult what's called the SWIM reporting guideline, which is stands for Synthesis Without Meta-Analysis, which came out, I think, last year, which is designed specifically for your more narrative synthesis type reviews. So I think across both of those sources, it would be quite helpful, I would hope.
Okay, great. And then a comment from Sheila. So she says, I try to use a relevant reporting guideline as a learning tool when supervising PhD students from the start of their proposal development. It makes their thinking about the research more robust. And then a question from Mbulusi. How feasible is utilizing this method of reviewing literature in other fields outside the medicine and other health-related research areas?
Yeah, I think that a lot of the items in PRISMA 2020 are applicable to reviews outside of medical health intervention type reviews. Some probably might not be as relevant, but I think across the board, when we did our previous evaluation of other reporting guidelines for different types of research synthesis, there was still quite a lot of consistency across the guidance. So I think that unless you are working in a field for which there already is a dedicated reporting guideline, I think that I'd encourage people to use PRISMA 2020. But yeah, for example, there is for those who are working on reviews in ecology and ecology and evolutionary biology, there's now a PRISMA extension for that. There are quite a lot of guidelines for reviews of psychological experiments. So I know the meta-analysis reporting standards by the American Psychological Association has some useful guidance for those who are evaluating more psychology experiments, not reviews of interventions. But again, there's quite a lot of overlap with the recommendations. So I think people could be comfortable using PRISMA 2020 for that purpose.
Okay, great. And then another question from Sharon Singh. What software tools do you recommend to assist one with systematic literature reviews?
Software tools, I think, I mean, I think I've often used Covidence for screening articles. That's mainly because I've got my colleagues here in Melbourne developed the software, so I'm almost contractually obliged to promote it. But I mean, I often use RevMan or R to conduct the analyses. I know there's a lot more tools available for all steps of the process of doing a review in R, and I strongly recommend looking up two websites. There's the SR Toolbox, which provides links to a range of different software and tools to help do reviews. And in addition, the Evidence Synthesis Hackathon website also collates a range of different software that have been developed to doing reviews. But yeah, I haven't used many of them myself personally, but I know others have. I tend to have spent a lot more time recently doing these type of methods papers rather than doing the reviews themselves. So, but I think I've heard lots of good things about the tools listed at those various websites.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Matthew. I don't see any more comments and questions coming through. Yeah, looks like we've answered everything. So thank you again, Matthew, once more for a great presentation, really insightful. I'm pretty sure all of us will be engaging with PRISMA 2020 in time to come as we progress with our bits of research. And then to everyone else, thank you very much for participating, asking questions, and attending today's webinar. Really great questions that were posed to Matthew. And please look out for our posting on YouTube, and also future emails with up and coming webinars, methods webinars that will be coming through shortly, and as we also plan for the next year to come. Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Slides will also be circulated afterwards. And thanks, Matthew, once again.
No worries. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, keep well, everyone.